Hello guys, and welcome back to another Tales from the Horadric Library tome for Diablo. If you guys missed the last video, we have the introduction of the tome, aka the book, where we kind of just went over some of what we're going to do with the stories and where we're at. So now we are going to be on the Gospel of Death, which is on page 13, written by Matthew J. Kirby, illustrated by Stanton Fang. So I'm going to read these out. I'm going to show you guys pages. When the pictures come about, I'll make sure I give you guys detail of the pictures. So today's video or story we're reading is The Gospel of Death. Chapter 1 or 1. In those days, when the firstborn were still young, they rode a company of 4 warriors renowned for their strength and cunning as hunters. There was Horadric, as silent and pale as the clouds, and as agile as the wind. Her knives could pierce the toughest of hides to find the soft and inward parts of her prey. There was Horadric, the strongest of his companions, red of hair and beard, given to merriment when at the rest around the cook fire, and violent ferocity when roused to anger. There was Horadric, black-haired and discerning, who would sometimes let her quarry live to see another sunrise. And lastly, there was Garshin, with warm eyes and dark skin, beloved of the other 3 for his wisdom and the lethal grace with which he wielded any weapon placed in his hands. From that company it was said that no animal could conceal its tracks, and that no beast could stand against them. Neither the bears and wolves of the forest, nor the great spiders of the fenlands and jungles, nor the cats and worms of the desert dunes. Always the 4 hunted together, their loyalty as that of kin, their bond as that of blood sworn. And though they brought swift death upon their blades, they have never known it for themselves. None of the firstborn in which century had yet tasted death, for they were still young in those days. This is how death found them. One night, Horadric had a dream, and in his dream he made a spear from a cypress tree and hurled it from the top of a tower in the golden city where he and his companions dwelt. The spear flew high and true, faster and further than any eagle, over the mountains and into the vast green steeps beyond. When Horadric awakened, he thought for a time on the meaning of his dream, and then went to speak of it with the other 3. These are in parentheses. A hunt has come into my heart and mind, he said. Garshin was the first to ask, where shall we seek our prey this time? Over the mountains and into the green steeps, Horadric said, where he had never hunted. And what are we to stalk there? Asked Horadric, her eyes alight with the cold gleam of a deep lake by moonlight. Horadric grinned and said, the wild cattle's herds. This answer gave his companions pause, for the beasts he spoke of were the mighty orches of old. It's a hard word right there. It's orches of old. We're gonna go with that. I'm not the best scholar here, but I'm the best reader, but I'm a good scholar. Let's play. He spoke of were the mighty archers of old. So the answer he gave was his companions paused. For the beasts he spoke of were the mighty orcs of old, now vanished from the land, hunted to extinction. Some believe by the northerners, who wore the orches shaggy coats and grew large and powerful on their flesh. These animals thundered over the steeps, as large as a caravan's wagon, with broad horns and iron hooves, and their queen was Haduma, the earth breaker, she who could thaw the frozen sea with the hot breath from her nostrils. We have never faced such a challenge, said Grushin, and when Berserk asked him what he feared, he replied, only that we will fail. Fail. I want to say fall, sorry. To which Berserk said, but we are the children of angels and demons. We cannot fail. They were with him, of course, as he was with them, to the ends and farthest reaches of sanctuary. And so they prepared themselves for 3 days, sharpening their weapons and taking strength into their limbs. For once the chase has begun, there would be no rest until they brought their quarry down. On the 4th day they left the Golden City, where they dwelt, and traveled northward until they reached an upland of bare fells, over which a sharp wind howled. Above those shelves they came to the mountains, where gray clouds filled the narrow gorges and gaps with ice, and their crossings was hard. Shrill voices called from the mist around them, hoarding them until they entered a high pass, and in a lonely place they were set upon. Great beasts of the air flew at them from all sides and descended from hidden areas in the sheer rock's walls. The fog made it difficult to see the attackers, but the beast of their wings drove a furtive smile into the mouths and nose of the warriors, and gasping talons tore the air. In a flash of steel, the 4 companions drew their weapons and stood shoulder to shoulder, facing outward, pushing back their enemy with quick strikes. The flying forms that whipped around them in the mist did not retreat from their sudden defense, but simply withdrew to circle them in patient arcs at a distance. More heard than seen as their screeching echoed up and down the pass. What are they? Grushin asked. It seems they are kin to bloodhawks. Horadric peered at the dark ichor on one of her knives, left by a bite its edge had given. Though they do not fall as easily. Let us test that, Berserk said, and he threw one of his hatchets at the nearest swooping shadow. The weapon wheeled through the air, landed with a squinch, and the creature dropped as a stone. There, you see, Horadric, he said. They fall. Perhaps, Horadric said, looking upward, but they are numerous. Overhead, as if in response to the slaying of their comrades, the voices of the monsters changed from shrieks to a vicious chatter. Their circular plaids through the air tightened, and they came closer, emerging from the mist with red eyes, leathery heads, and gray feather wings as broad as tower shields. They are prepping for another assault, Grushin said. Berserk growled at that and replied, let them come. When the flying beast fell upon them, they descended as a winged storm of beak and claw, but the warriors met the attack with their own practiced savagery. Horadric's knives carved meat as easily as air, slicing wing from beast. Grushin's sword swaying as it took head, slicing all within its reach. The point of Helgroth's spear parted feather, skin, and bone. Berserk soon cast aside his great axe and went to work with his hands, snatching the bird from the air and rending them asunder in showers of blood. The skirmish ended quickly, leaving the hard frozen ground slick with gore, a ring of ruined carcasses around the warriors. The few survivors who escaped fled back into the mist, up to their nests, their wretched calls fading as the warriors laughed in triumph. After the battle fever subsided, the 4 claimed their weapons and took many talons as trophies. In doing so, Horadric studied them. Noting their curve and the cut of the creatures' beaks, she said. They are scavengers. Scavengers? Grushin chuckled at that. What makes them think they can feast on our flesh as they would the bones of animals? They are mindless, Berserk said. Then he lifted his head and shouted into the fog, but we have taught them well. Though puzzled by the boldness of their attackers, the hunters were not troubled. for they were the firstborn, and in those days death had not yet taught them what they would soon learn, and they left that high place to continue their hunt. Some might say they had no need to press on, having found worthy prey there atop of the mountains. But they had not yet taken any of their intended quarry, so they went over the pass and came down the other side. The green steeps stretched beyond the reach of their eyes, a vast expanse of rolling earth that took as much note of them as the endless sea take of a single boat. At first they saw no track or dung of the great arches, but they set out undulated into the land, which was in those days cold and covered in brittle grasses, heath, and gross. The sun rose 3 times, and they traveled many leagues before Groshin spotted distant herd signs. "I see their trail," he said, when he pointed toward his companions scuffled. Again, in the little box here, we have a note. What makes them think they can feast on our flesh as they would the bones of animals? I'm going to turn the page. "This is no trail," Bazaric said. "It is too big. That is a dry riverbed." But the hunters learned that Grushin had the right of it when they were finally reached the right track and stood within its ragged borders. The hooves of the archers had stamped a furrow in the ground as deep and as broad as any channel carved by water or wind. And 3 teeth had stripped the plain bare, leaving only trampled roots. The 4 warriors looked around them, dwarfed by the wreckage and beginning to weary, and again Gordon said, "We have never faced such a challenge." Doubt touched even Bazaric then, but he recalled his dream, and he drew strength from it. "We will prevail. It is our birthright." The other 3 believed him. They ignored the weakness creeping into their limbs and followed their herd's trail for another day and night. And in the chill of dawn, on their 5th day in the green steeps, they came upon the herd. Their arches resembled a brown hill on the horizon, and a light from the low morning sun blazed through a misty cloud rising off them from their breath and heat. A pale frost covered the ground, and it melted beneath the soles of the warriors' boots, leaving dark footsteps behind them as they crept closer. But before they approached too near the beast, the hunters dropped to their chests and crawled forward, peering through the grass. "We'll need to separate one from the herd," Helgaroth said. "That is the only way to bring one of them down." "Separate it and surround it," Corvick said. "What of the others?" Grushin asked. "What if they defend their own?" "Threaten one and the others will run," Bazaric said. "It is the way of herds." Then they crafted their strategy by choosing their archers one at the edge and planning their approach. Then they used what contours in the land they could find to weave closer. Follow the dips and throughs until they attained their position. To Corvick fell the task of startling the herd, for she had the greatest skill at stalking unseen and could get close without being discovered. She leapt from the grass. Her willing jolted the archers into running unthinking from her. Most of the herd stampeded eastward, while their chosen quarry bolted in the opposite direction. When it came to its senses and realized its mistake, it veered to change its course, but then Helgaroth rose before it from the grass and threw her spear. The shaft landed in the path of the beast and turned it again. Even as the herd thundered on, Bazaric and Grushin then closed in, completely in the circle, arms outstretched, weapons rattling. The arch was enormous, as tall as it is shoulders as Bazaric. It snorted and wheeled. Snapping its hooves, it threw its head back, brandishing its wide horns and tossing its shaggy bronze coat. Bazaric roared at it, intending to distract the beast so Grushin could plunge its sword between its ribs to stab its heart. But the ground trembled beneath their feet, and Grushin never struck. Haduma, the Earthbreaker, came then. bellowing with the voice of 1,000 trumpets. Fire burned in the Orochi's queen's eyes, and smoke poured from her nostrils. Her every hoofbeat shouted the ground as she charged towards the hunters. Groshin stood before her, and the trapped Orochis, and though his companions shouted and pleaded with him to flee, he was too stunned by the bulk of Haduma's form and ferocity to move. Berserk threw his great axe at the oncoming beast, but it glanced off one of her horns. He took up Halgaroth's spear from the ground where it stood, and as he hurled it, he remembered his dream. The spear struck Haduma in the wedge between her neck and shoulder, a killing blow for a lesser being. But the point could find no purchase in her thick hide and fell away. As Haduma reached Groshin, she dropped her head low and lifted him into the air on the tip of her right horn. Opening his belly, he fell to the earth tangled with his innards, and then Haduma barreled over him, utterly breaking him. His companions stood by, powerless, allowing the trapped Orochis to flee, and when it was safely away, Haduma gave one final snort over Groshin that churned up clods of reddened dirt. Then, satisfied, she also left and returned to her herd. Berserk, Halgaroth, and Horadric ran to their beloved, who lay twisted and blinking in the torn earth, unable to voice his agony. His jaw twitched, but formed no words, and a few moments later, he died. We are on 2. Now, I am getting a little nervous because my phone doesn't have a lot of memory, so it might actually stop the stream. I was trying to do this on the tablet, but it's hard for me to angle it. We're going to get as far as we can. If we cut off, I'll try to edit the videos together and we'll post them. In that way, those early days came to an end. Death had found their firstborn there in the green steeps through the 3 hunters did, not yet understand as they knelt around the river corpse of their companions. They knew that Groshin was no longer Groshin. Something vile had gone out of him, leaving behind an empty vessel, a cold heath, a forsaken ruin. Time passed in silence, unreckoned, until the sun had set and drew abroad the fallen brows of our warriors. Halgaroth was the first to speak. We are no greater than the lowest beast that we have hunted and slain. How could we not see? How did we not know? We have been fools. Horadric agreed. Even those mindless Charon's feeders knew what we did not. Berserk said nothing, but he trembled at a battle fought between his heart and mind. In his heart, he wanted to kill Haduma, but she was mighty, and now he knew fear for which he hated himself. In his mind, he knew that slaying Haduma would not bring him peace, for though she had shown the firstborn they could die, she had not made them mortal. A third truth he hid from both his heart and his mind. When the crescent moon rose over the green steeps, Halgaroth shivered under his thin light and looked up. "I must go," she said. And when Horadric asked her where she would go, she answered, "Where death cannot find me." Horadric doubted that death could be so evaded, for in looking at Groshin's burst flesh, she now believed they all carried death hidden somewhere within them. But she kept these thoughts to herself. Halgaroth rose to her feet after giving a parting embrace to Horadric and Berserk. She walked away from them into the darkness. As you can see the illustration here. A short time later, Berserk said, "I also know what I must do." And when Horadric asked him what he must do, he answered, "I will hold them to account." And when Horadric asked him who he meant, he answered, "Those who made us." Horadric pondered this and said, "They are more powerful than Haduma. You will need a powerful weapon to challenge them." Then she took out her knives and she reached into Groshin with her fingers and her blades. She speared him out across the grass, searching for the secret place where he had carried his death within him. But she did not find it. Defeated in that, she set herself to her next task, fashioning the sprayed bones and cords of him into something else. Berserk watched her work until he could not endure it. thereafter listening with closed eyes to the dull crack of bones, a wet slap of tissue. Smelling the odors of groceries outpouring, wild and confounded and lost in horror, mute and resigned. When Koritz finished, the pale yellow weapon she had crafted frightened Bazarek more than Alduma. It seemed to quiver in his hand. His sword made in hatred for tearing more than slicing, a jagged and thorny branch of bone shards bound together with sinew and uncurled stripes of hide. Its fragments defied Bazarek's attempt to map where they had come from, as though Korvik had remained Grecian so completely that his original form had been lost. With all his grace and wisdom, this weapon is called Severian. Korvik said, "Keep it close to you, and the journey will straighten it." Bazarek thanked her and asked what she would do after they parted. "These are questions I would put to death," she said, "but first I must find the camp of our hunter." Bazarek did not know what she meant by that, but neither did he want to know. She stood before him, smiling of her labors, her arms stained by the blood of their friend, and he sensed that she had already traveled some distance down a very different road from his. All that remained was to bid her farewell, and then he wrapped Severian in his cloak and strapped the sword to his back. He set off on a journey that took him from the green steeps over many lands. He crossed treacherous mountains and forded icy rivers, and along the way he spoke to the sword over his shoulder as if it were a companion at his side. He recounted his memories of Grecian, at times with laughter and at times with tears. These words fell on the grain of Severian's hide, softening and withering it. Then Bazarek voiced his sorrow at Grecian's death, and these words settled into the fibrous web of Severian's ligaments, bracing and tightening them against the pain. Finally, Bazarek hissed his rage and hatred, and those words burned into the pores of Severian's bones, tempering them until they were harder than iron. We have a little box again. Along the way, he spoke to the sword over his shoulders as if it were a companion at his side. And an illustration here. This must be Grecian dead, and the other four firstborns kind of just mourning over his death. Many days and moons passed, and Bazarek suffered many hardships before he came to the dwelling place of the mother and father of all. They who had created sanctuary, and the first of the firstborn. The insurgent spires of their fortress temple rose with elegiac grace, and persisted to such heights that they seemed to touch the cold stars, while its foundations clawed and dug with demonic hunger down to the roots of the world, where the fires of creation could almost warm the stone. It loomed with such terrible grandeur that Bazarek wavered in his resolve at the sight of it, for he had rested little on his journeys, and the burden of knowledge he carried stole much of his strength. But he would not be daunted, and so he pressed ahead toward the house of angels and demons. Before he attained the first of his many gates, he met one of his kindred on the road. This man, Kalmor, noticed the grime and signs of Bazarek's ordeals and asked him, "Are you well, brother?" Bazarek answered, "I am well enough for what I must do." Then Kalmor saw in Bazarek's eyes the dark cast of his heart and mind, and he blocked Bazarek's passage, asking, "What is it you go to do?" "I go to those who made us," Bazarek said. Unsatisfied by the answer, Kalmor asked, "For what purpose? What would you say to them?" And Bazarek answered, "I do not go to speak with them." Then Kalmor perceived that Bazarek intended violence against their makers, and he resolved to stop Bazarek's blasphemy by the word if he could, and by force if he must. "Watch yourself, brother," he said. "Remember, it is they who gave us life." Sorry. Bazarek laughed, but it was a bitter sound full of poison and treachery. "They gave us death," he said. "They will pay for their sins in kind." Then he demanded that Kalmar let him pass, but having now heard Bazar's open threat, Kalmar refused. Neither warrior fully grasped his own peril in that moment, nor did they fully understand the mind and heart of the other. And so their battle began. Bazark swung his great axe, keeping serene at stealth what was to come after, and Kalmar fought with his sword. Their strikes rang out against the walls of the fortress above them, and echoed in its courtyards and chambers as they fought. Kalmar pleaded with Bazark to lay down his weapon, but Bazark refused, even though he knew his journey had weakened him, and that Kalmar opposed at full might. For half a day they traded blow for blow, blood for blood, neither prevailing, but then Bazark faltered. His strength had finally begun to wane, and Kalmar succeeded in ripping his great axe from his hand. In desperation, Bazark drew Severian, but the sword seemed almost to balk in his hand, for it had not been crafted to fight Guthrun's own kin. Another of the firstborn, then Kalmar landed a blow with Bazark's own axe that clove him from his shoulder to breastbone, exposing his beating heart. The wound shocked both warriors, for never had one of the firstborns given such injury to another. Bazark slumped, he'd blowed. Unblinking, Kalmar sat next to him and said, "I am sorry it came to this." "Do not be," Bazark said, for as he greeted death, his mind and his heart surrendered. Their battle to the truth he had hidden from both. "It was I who led our hunt against Guthrun's warnings. I am to blame for his death. In punishing me, you have given me justice." Then, as the blood falling out of him slowed and his heart beat its last, he gasped and said, "You will now see what becomes of me, and you will know what brought me here. Take this bone sword and use it as you deem best." Then Bazark died, for death had found sanctuary and it could not be stopped. In that way, Kalmar learned that he also could die, and might have died there had the battle gone a different way. Instead, it was Bazark who lay split open before him. An affront to life, Kalmar did not know what to do with the corpse, but neither did he welcome the thought of carrion eaters feasting on it. So he laid the dead warrior in the ground and piled stones over him to protect him and marked that place. He stood Bazark's great axe upright in the rocks at the top of the cairn, but he kept the bone sword as Bazark asked. He understood why Bazark had come, and he shared some of the dead warrior's anger. After he had finished his grim task, the gate of the fortress temple opened, and a blazing angelic herald appeared with a summons, saying Kalmar's battle with Bazark had been observed from on high, and a council had been called. Kalmar obeyed the summons and entered that place, believing he would be punished for slaying another firstborn. But when he stood before the council of angels and demon kind, they did not punish him. "You fought in our name," they said. Their voices filled Kalmar's mind as a rushing wind and a roaring inferno. "You honored your birthright and legacy." Kalmar's head bowed before the blinding majesty of the angels and the baleful power of the demons, tightening his grip on Severian, and said, "There is more to my birthright than I knew. I have seen it." "You refer to death," the council said, "but you were never promised a life without end. That gift is not ours to give. We do not even possess it for ourselves. As our children, you will not age, nor will you be touched by the corruption of plague. But you may die. Should your strength be tested by a trial that is beyond you, you may die. Should you, through carelessness or foolishness, place yourself in death's path, do you understand?" "I understand now that death is earned," Kalmar said, and then he asked what he should do with Severian. The demons looked on the bone sword and said nothing, but the angels turned away from it in disgust, for it reminded them of a weapons and abomination created at the Hellforge. "It is a blasphemy," they said. "Destroy it." Kalmar bowed his head lower, and the council departed, save one demon who called Kalmar to her. "What would you have of me?" blessed mother?" Calmer asked. "Give me that sword," she said. Calmer gave Servian to her, and then he followed her from the council chambers down twisted stairs and a long, forgotten passage to a place deep in the bowels of the fortress temple. There she lit a furnace that burned with a heat Calmer could barely withstand, and he watched as she broke the magic of the bone sword, melting its greases, unrevealing its plated filaments, and charring its bones. She kept its strength, its pain, and its rage, but she twisted and present the essence of Servian within a new weapon of her own crafting. The gleaming sword she forged seemed far too broad and too heavy for Calmer to wield. A blade meant for a much greater being than any of the firstborn, and yet the demon presented it to Calmer upon its completion. "I have made this blade for a purpose," she said. "When you are in pursuit of its purpose, the sword will grant you the strength you need to wield it." "What is its purpose?" he asked. His heart traveled with other words who may share his lust for vengeance, she said. "You will seek them out, and when you find them, you will use this sword to punish them, for in turning against us, they have dishonored their legacy as the firstborn." "It will be done, Mother," Calmer said. Then he lifted the sword and discovered that she had spoken the truth. The weapon felt no heavier in his hands than his own, yet it would strike with the devastating might of a demon's blade. Calmer left the house of angel and demonkind with the great sword to pursue his errand. Searching across sanctuary for Corvic and Helgaroth, he explored the uninhabited regions in the deep shadows beneath silent, towering forests across the hot, blowing sands of distant desert. In his travel, he witnessed the spreading reach of Death's hand, which waited endlessly and patiently for those who earned its embrace. He hunted for many years without any signs of success, and during those days, the firstborn had children, and their children had children. His journey took him through towns and villages and camps. Everywhere he went, he asked after the two, but none had seen them. Over time, Calmer grew disheartened by his failure to fulfill his quest, until one day he came upon a fellow traveler resting beside the road. He shared a meal with her, and when their talk turned to their reasons for being in that place, the traveler said, "I have heard a rumor that might interest you." "A rumor is better than no word at all," replied Calmer. The traveler then told him about a man she had met hasting from a village many days, journeying from there where several had gone missing in a pass through the hills nearby. The villagers spoke of a great evil that dwells there. The traveler said they gave it no name. They said only that it's a lair, it is a temple of death. The traveler shivered as if chilled through. She sat in the warmth of the sun. This man, she said, would have taken the road had they not warned him, and he believed he had escaped death. "What do you believe?" Calmer asked. "I believe it is often wise to heed rumors," the traveler said. "I would not go near such a place, but if I were seeking an evil, that would..." I want to pause there because I want to go ahead and let you guys see the illustration of this page here. You can see Inarius on the throne next to Lilith, the Blessed Mother, and angels and demons. As Calmer is being presented this sword that Lilith has crafted. Now, I don't want to spoil anything in the game, but there seems to be some stuff to go into the game here, which is really cool. So as we were, I would not go near such a place, but if I were seeking an evil that would defy those who made us, I believe it might be found there. Calmer thanked the traveler and went in pursuit of this rumor, first to the village where they begged him to go no further. They lived and raised their sheep in gray shadows beneath bleak moors, where the wet ground birthed clouds of biting flies, and their hearth fires struggled to keep the damp and cold at bay. They promised him that death waited in the pass through the cursed hills. "Death is earned," he said to them, "but I do not believe that this trial is beyond me. I go with a power greater than my own." The sight of an enormous sword he carried kindled hope in some of the villagers. though not in those few who had glimpsed that place for themselves and lived with the memory of it. They all insisted he ate and rest before setting out again. Calmer obliged for them one night and left them at dawn. The hills he ventured into reminded him of the cairn he had piled over Bazarks many years before. It seemed a sickness festering under their rocky slopes, a withering blight at the roots of that sapped and blackened all but the lowest and most wretched scrub attempting to grow there. A suffocating silence lay upon that land, a void where no living thing stirred, and with every step the absence leached a hollow in Calmer's heart. When at last he heard a sound, it was the screeching of carrion eaters, which only deepened his dread even as it gave him a sign to follow. He looked up to where they circled in the sky, and he moved toward them, knowing death would be found close by. That is how Calmer found Horadric and the temple she had built. The sight of her lair almost caused him to quake, and he doubted whether even the sword had been given could stand against such an obscenity. He stepped onto a castaway paved with the skulls of animals and firstborns that climbed upward flanked by impaled, investigated corpses. The dead faced toward the temple, arms outreached and daped with the coils of their own viscera. And as Calmer walked that hollowing road, he had to shut his ears against the sound of moaning for fear it was not the voices of the wind he heard. At the top of the castaway stood an oratory constructed of flesh and bone, and Calmer could not begin to count or measure the number of dead required to build it. The alchemy of desiccation and putrefaction had rendered its raw materials into a conglomerate mass of tissue that oozed and wept from vivid fissures, and from which hair still sprouted here and there. Calmer thought the smell of it could drive him mad as he marched towards eyes and nose burning. The door to the temple gaped like a chapped mouth, and before Calmer entered it, he drew the sword he had been given. Its powers filled him as though the weapon sensed where it was and was eager to begin the work for which it had been forged. He stepped inside and heard a voice with the fluid warmth of fresh blood. "Have you come to die for me?" Horadric asked. She stood behind an altar that was swathed in a skirt of thick waxen runnels of dried. And again, I'm going to stop right there, let you guys see the illustration. And you can see Horadric is over here making something. It looks like a body she's carving into. And then you can see Calmer with his blade in hand as he walks in. She stood behind an altar that was swathed in a skirt of thick waxen runnels of dried blood and untold layers of suffering. Upon the altar lay the gutted body of an old man, organs still wet and quivering, seized mouth and eyes open wide and unmoving. "I have been sent to punish you," Calmer said. Horadric stepped out from behind the altar and came toward him. All of her once pale skin now turned a molded red. "Who has sent you to punish me?" she asked. "Those who made you," Calmer replied. Her frown seemed almost disappointed as she said, "I do not fear them, and neither should you. There is a power far greater than theirs." "You speak of death," Calmer said. She nodded and said, "It is the only power that matters. It is the power I have sought and worshipped these many years. It is the power I will master, and then I will rule over even those who made us." Calmer looked around them at her monstrous desecrations and said, "You did not do this to master death. You did this to master your fear of death. And now that your death is here, I wonder if you are afraid." Horadric leaped at him with a speed far beyond what he expected, and her knife slashed at him with startling strength. The essence of all the death that she had claimed filled her with savage power, and she drove Calmer from her temple, out onto the castaway, shouting, I have witnessed death in all its shapes, methods, and guises. I have looked into its eyes and tasted living flesh. It is you who stinks of fear. Though Calmer was indeed afraid, he shouted back at her, I will slay you as I slew Brazaric, at which she suddenly halted her attack, laughing at him and said, You lie. I watched the last beat of his heart, Calmer said. Horadric held up her knives and readied herself to end him as he said, Then tell me what became of Brazaric's weapon if you truly slew him. Calmer raised the demon-forged blade and said, It was remade. Horadric looked closely at the great sword and descried the truth of its lineage. Whereupon she lowered her knives under the weight of nearly forgotten memories and whispered, Grushin. Calmer swung the blade. It passed through Horadric's arm, taking her hand, and stopped deep in her side, almost cutting her in two. She folded apart and spilled onto the castaway. And as she lays there, tears washed some of the dark stain from under her eyes. I am afraid, she said, and died. Calmer stood over her, surrounded by the silent howling of the dead, and could find no pity in his heart for her. You earned this, he said, and he left her body out in the open for the carrion eaters that had guided him there, who perhaps still knew more of death than she. He did not stop in the village. They would have asked what he had seen and done, and he did not want to speak of those things, but they witnessed his safe return down the road. In that way, they knew the trial had not been beyond him, though the path through the hills remained a haunted place for many generations after, avoided by all save the foolish, those drawn to evil. For many more years, Calmer wandered in search of Horadric, the last of Brazaric's companions, and for years she eluded him. Though the firstborn continued to grow and prosper in sanctuary, Calmer again became discouraged. The great sword he carried felt heavier in his hand, as though it knew of his failure and had begun to revoke the strength it had lent him. He did not blame the weapon for this, and he told it much as one night as he said before his cook fire. Perhaps she is already dead, he said. If she moves under the sun, I would have found her. The sword replied only with a dark glint that put Calmer in mind of the midnight sky above him. Perhaps she does not move under the sun, he said. And from that moment he searched for Horadric after the sun had set. His wandering acquainted him with the creatures of night and the many depths of the shadow cast by moonlight. His search took him down strange roads and hidden turnings, until one evening he came to a great woodland. He saw no road into it, nor even a footpath, and he felt many threatening eyes upon him. He went to a nearby inn and inquired of the folks there to learn more about the wood, but he found that none would speak of it, and that the very mention of it seemed to dim the light of the candles. Then a hunter arrived, and Calmer was told he should speak with that man if he would want to know about the wood. So Calmer asked him. Only a fool will go in there, the hunter said. And when Calmer asked whether he went in, the hunter replied, I do, and I am counted a fool, but I am not a fool. I go in only when the sun is high, and I leave before it sets. What happens after the sun has set? Calmer asked. The hunter leaned in close to murmur, At night? That place in the domain of the wood? Which? She knows every branch on every tree, and she can speak with the animals, and they do her bidding. Many a snare of mine has been robbed of its bait without springing. Many a time I have caught some creature watching me with eyes that know too much. The wood witch has taught them well. Calmer thanked the hunter and waited at the inn for daylight. Then he went back to the wood, and from its first step under the trees he felt the awareness of countless nameless things and breathed air that was thick and laden with malice. He worked his way inward, pressing through bramble and ducking beneath the heavy low branches of colossal trees, until he reached a glade. As its center rose a tall standing stone, and the silent dignity of its demanded reverence. It reminded Calmer of the cairn he had raised over Brazaric, and he sat down next to it to wait. We have another little box here, and in this box it says, You did this to master your fear of death, and now that your death is here, I wonder if you are afraid. When night fell over the wood, the glade and standing stone glowed with him brilliance in the light of the moon and stars. Clamor stood and raised his voice, shouting Helgaroth name. His summons sounded weak in that place, as though even the trees ignored him. But he called again, and then a third time. In answer the wood said a fox that circled Clamor and standing stone at a distance, its tails flashing in the tall, soft grass. When the animal returned to the edge of the clearing, it paused to stare at Clamor before vanishing. Then the wood sent a great spider that did not come into the moonlight. It skittered and clicked from the trees, circling the glade, studying Clamor with many glittering eyes. And when it departed, it felt silk and nets behind in the night branches. Then the wood sent an owl with luscious silver plumage and onyx talons. It swooped and circled high above Clamor, and it screeched at him before it soared away. Then the wood sent an enormous bear which did not circle the glade. It charged at Clamor from the tree so quickly that he had not even raised his blade. When he felt himself trembling through the air, heaved afloat by a single swipe of the beast's paw, Clamor landed in the soft grass without breath and without his weapon. Grasping as the bear came again, brown coat rippling, white teeth gleaming, Clamor believed that Maw would tear out his throat in the next moment. But a calm voice floated through the clearing. Berserk, halt, Helgaroth said, and the bear obeyed. She carried a spear, and a short sword hung from her belt. Clamor looked for his blade, and found where it had fallen several paces away. While out of his reach and blocked by the immensity of the bear, Helgaroth stood next to the animal and laid a hand against its shoulders. There is no common hunter, she said. Let us learn something of him before you eat him. Clamor staggered to his feet and said, I knew Berserk. Do you call this bear by that name to honor its namesake? Helgaroth shook her head and answered, I mourn its namesake still. That softened Clamor's heart toward her as he spoke, saying, You are Helgaroth, which she acknowledged, and when she asked his name, Clamor gave it. You should have known that I slew Berserk and I slew Horadric, he said. Helgaroth showed no surprise at this. She merely sighed and said, Now you have come to kill me, and I see you have been given the means to do it. I suppose I have been waiting for you all these long years. I gave up living under the sun and moved only under cover of night, trying to hide from the death. Still death has found me, and still I am a fool. How are you a fool? Clamor said. She pondered her answer and then gave it, saying, I see now that I cannot hide from death. No one can, nor can death be mastered through worship and flattery. To rage in defiance of death is to hasten it. Clamor agreed with her and said, Death is earned. Helgaroth shook her head, and stroking the bear's fur, she said, All my years of hunting and all my years of hiding have taught me that depth simply is, and that it must be. What is a fortress without a wall? What is a glade without the forest? It is a border that defines the worth and meaning of what lies within, and death is but the inevitable boundary of life. Clamor disagreed with her. He still believed mortality to be weakness, a disease the firstborn had been spared, and for that he had felt that should be grateful, but he kept these things to himself. Helgaroth's lacks of gratitude offended him, but he knew she carried no blasphemy in her heart, nor a lust for vengeance against those who had made them. So when she asked him when he intended to kill her, he answered, I do not intend to kill you. My errand is finished. He walked around the bear to where the great sword lay, its purpose fulfilled. When he bent to pick it up, he found it almost too heavy to lift, but with effort he raised it over his head. He then brought the blade down, flat against the standing stone, and the metal sparked against the rock with a peal of thunder and a rushing wind. The weapon broke in two, and Clamor buried the pieces there in a glade. Helgaroth watched this task with sadness at the final ending of her former company. Then Clamor looked again at the great bear and said to Helgaroth, I will leave your wood now, if I may go in peace. You may leave as you wish, unharmed, she replied, but peace you must find for yourself. Then Kalmar and Hagorath parted, he to his fate and she to hers. There are many stories told of what they each did after their meeting, and how they both came finally to their death. But those are tales told elsewhere. In another little box, we have a quote, I see now that I cannot hide from death. No one can, nor can death be mastered through worship and flattery. You turn the page. I think that was it. Let me know what you guys think about the story in the comments down below. Until next time, I'll read to you later.